The small New Dawn sanctuary stood as a beacon of peace in the heart of the bustling city. Its stained glass windows cast vibrant patterns across the wooden pews, and the air carried a faint, calming scent of incense. Father Gabriel Monroe, a tall black man with broad shoulders, a warm smile, and a deep, resonant voice, stood at the pulpit, delivering his Sunday sermon. His words were a blend of wisdom and compassion, drawing the congregation into rapt attention, hanging on to every syllable. Father Monroe had been the pastor of St. Michael's Church for over a year, and in that time he had become a pillar of the community. His sermons were not just about faith but about unity, love, and standing up for what was right. Under his leadership, the church had flourished, welcoming people from all walks of life. It was a place where everyone felt accepted, no matter their circumstances. As the service ended, the congregation began to disperse, exchanging warm handshakes and heartfelt greetings with Father Monroe. The atmosphere was filled with kindness and camaraderie. But just as the last of the parishioners were about to leave, the heavy wooden doors of the church suddenly creaked open with a loud groan. A police officer stepped inside, his uniform crisp, his expression stern. His name tag read Officer Adam Lawson, and his sharp blue eyes scanned the room with a look of suspicion. He removed his hat, revealing a closely cropped head, then strode purposefully toward Father Monroe. "Father," Officer Adam Lawson said firmly, his voice carrying authority. "I need to speak with you." Father Monroe turned to face him, his expression calm yet inquisitive. "Of course, officer. How can I help you?" The officer glanced around the church, his gaze lingering on a few remaining parishioners. "We've received reports of suspicious activity here, people coming and going at unusual hours. I need to ask you some questions." Father Monroe nodded, clasping his hands together in front of him. "I understand. This is a place of worship, officer. Our doors are always open to those in need. If people have been coming at odd hours, it's because they are seeking comfort or assistance." Officer Adam Lawson's jaw tightened. "That may be, Father, but we've had complaints. Some of the individuals seen here have been described as questionable." Father Monroe raised an eyebrow. "Questionable in what way?" The officer hesitated, his eyes flickering toward the remaining churchgoers. "They just don't look like typical churchgoers." Father Monroe's expression hardened slightly, though his tone remained steady. "Officer, this church does not discriminate. We welcome all people, regardless of who they are or where they come from. If that makes some people uncomfortable, then I'm afraid that's their problem, not ours." A tense silence filled the room. The remaining parishioners exchanged uneasy glances, uncertain of how to react. Officer Adam Lawson took a step closer, lowering his voice almost to a whisper, his tone carrying a subtle edge of intimidation. "Look, Father, I'm just doing my job. If you have nothing to hide, then you won't mind answering a few more questions, will you?" Father Monroe met the officer's gaze without flinching. "Ask away, officer. But I assure you, you won't find anything unusual here." The officer's eyes narrowed slightly, and for a moment it seemed as though he might push the issue further. But then he took a step back, his expression unreadable. "We'll see about that," he muttered before turning on his heel and striding out of the church. The heavy doors swung shut behind him, leaving behind a weighted silence. Father Monroe exhaled slowly, his hands still clasped together. He turned back to the remaining parishioners, his face softening. "Let us pray," he said, his voice steady and reassuring. "Pray for understanding, for compassion, and for the strength to stand up for what is right." The parishioners bowed their heads, their faith in Father Monroe unwavering. Yet, as they prayed, an unspoken unease lingered in the air. It was clear that this confrontation was far from over. The next day, Officer Adam Lawson returned to St. Michael's Church, this time accompanied by 2 other officers. Their footsteps echoed on the stone floor as they strode into the sanctuary, their posture rigid with determination. Father Monroe was preparing for the evening service when they arrived. "Father Monroe," Officer Adam Lawson announced, his voice carrying the weight of authority. "We need to search the church premises." Father Monroe turned to face them, his expression calm but resolute. "On what grounds, officer?" "We have reason to believe illegal activities may be taking place here," Adam Lawson replied, his tone firm. We're here to ensure the safety of the community." Father Monroe folded his arms across his chest, his gaze unwavering. "And what specific reason do you have? Have there been any concrete complaints?" Adam Lawson hesitated, his jaw clenching. "We've received reports of suspicious individuals frequently visiting this church. We need to investigate." Father Monroe nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. "I see. As I told you yesterday, this church is open to all. If they come here, it's because they need help or solace. But if you feel the need to search, then by all means, go ahead." The officers exchanged glances, clearly taken aback by Father Monroe's willingness to cooperate. Adam Lawson gave a curt nod to his colleagues, and they began methodically inspecting the church, examining every corner. Father Monroe stood silently, his hands clasped behind his back. He knew they would find nothing, but he also understood that this was more than just a search. This was a message, a warning that he and his congregation were being watched, that they would not be left alone. But he also knew something else. Neither he nor his church would be intimidated. As the officers moved through the church, they found nothing out of the ordinary. The classrooms were filled with children's drawings. The kitchen was stocked with food for the weekly soup program. The storage area was packed with donations for the homeless. Finally, they made their way to the basement, where Father Monroe had set up a small shelter for those in need. The room was filled with blankets and personal supplies. A few people sat around a table, eating a warm meal and conversing quietly. Officer Adam Lawson stepped into the room, narrowing his eyes as he surveyed the scene. "What is this?" he asked, his voice sharp. Father Monroe stepped forward, his expression calm yet resolute. "This is our community support program, officer. We provide shelter, food, and assistance to those who have nowhere else to go. These people are not criminals. They are human beings in need." Adam Lawson's jaw tightened. He seemed ready to argue, but then turned on his heel and motioned for his colleagues to leave. "We're done here," he said curtly. As the officers exited the church, Father Monroe watched them go, his expression thoughtful. He knew this wasn't over, but he also knew he had the support of his congregation, and together, they could face whatever challenges lay ahead. News of the raid spread quickly throughout the community, and by the next day, it was all anyone talked about. Residents were outraged that a place of worship had been subjected to such suspicion, with many viewing it as a clear case of racial discrimination. However, Father Monroe remained composed and measured. He understood that anger and frustration would only escalate the situation, and he was determined to handle it with grace and dignity. That evening, he called a meeting with the church leadership. They gathered in a small conference room, their faces filled with concern. "We need to speak out about this," a deacon said, his voice filled with frustration. "We can't just let them do whatever they want." Father Monroe nodded, his expression contemplative. "I agree, but we must be careful. We don't want to inflame the situation further. Instead, we need to show the community that we stand united and will not be intimidated." The room fell silent as everyone considered his words. Finally, an elder spoke up. "What do you propose, Father?" Father Monroe leaned forward, clasping his hands on the table. "I suggest we organize a community gathering. Invite everyone, our congregation, our neighbors, even the police. We will use this opportunity to show them who we are, that we are not a threat." The room buzzed with murmurs of agreement, and soon plans were set in motion. Flyers were printed, social media posts were shared, and word spread quickly throughout the neighborhood. By the time the gathering took place, the church was packed. People of all ages, races, and backgrounds came together, united for a common cause. The atmosphere was filled with solidarity and hope. Father Monroe stood before the congregation, his voice echoing through the room as he spoke. "Thank you all for being here today," he said, his tone warm and welcoming. "We have faced challenges, but I believe challenges are opportunities in disguise. They give us a chance to come together, to stand up for what we believe in, and to show the world who we truly are." Applause erupted from the crowd, their support for Father Monroe unwavering. He continued, his voice growing stronger with each word, "We are a community of faith, of love, and of compassion. We welcome everyone, no matter who they are or where they come from. and we will not be intimidated, we will not be silenced. We will stand together, united in our commitment to justice and equality." As he spoke, the crowd rose to their feet, cheers ringing through the room. It was a powerful moment, one that would be remembered for years to come. The community gathering had a profound impact, not just on the congregation but on the entire neighborhood. Those who had never stepped foot inside St. Michael's Church now came forward to show their support. The story quickly spread, drawing the attention of local media. News of the events at the small New Dawn sanctuary made headlines, appearing in newspapers, on television broadcasts, and across social media. Before long, reporters were knocking on the church's doors, eager to hear Father Monroe's perspective firsthand. They arrived with cameras, microphones, and pressing questions about what had happened, how the community had responded, and how the pastor himself felt about it all. But not everyone was pleased with the growing attention, especially Officer Adam Lawson. He was irritated that a case he had expected to be resolved quickly had, instead, become the focus of public scrutiny. The search was supposed to be a simple procedure, a routine task he had hoped to close quietly. Yet, instead of fading into obscurity, the incident had turned into a public relations nightmare. News reports relentlessly dissected how the police had handled the situation, igniting debates about justice, discrimination, and the rights of religious communities. A few days after the emotional gathering at the church, Officer Lawson decided to return, this time alone. No colleagues at his side, no badge or orders to fall back on. He arrived with a heavy heart, knowing he would have to face Father Monroe and confront the unanswered questions lingering in the air. As he stepped onto the church grounds, Lawson sensed a change in the atmosphere, something warmer, stronger. Though it was late, a light still shone from Father Monroe's office window. Taking a deep breath, he walked inside. Father Monroe was seated behind his desk, reviewing his schedule for the week. At the sound of the knock, he looked up, his gaze calm yet piercing. There was no anger or resentment, only the steady composure of a man who had seen everything clearly. "Officer Adam Lawson," Father Monroe greeted, his voice firm yet unshaken. "What brings you here?" Lawson stepped into the office, closing the door behind him. "This has gone too far," he said, his voice low and tense. "You turned this into a media spectacle, and it's making my job a lot harder." Father Monroe leaned back in his chair, clasping his hands together. "I'm sorry if that's how you feel, officer. But I didn't start this. You did. You walked into my church, accused me and my congregation of wrongdoing, and treated us with suspicion and disrespect. All I did was stand up for what is right." Lawson's jaw tightened, and for a moment it seemed like he was on the verge of losing his temper. But then he took a deep breath, his expression softening slightly. "Listen, Father, I'm just doing my job. I have a responsibility to protect this community." "And so do I," Father Monroe replied, his tone unwavering. "But protecting the community doesn't mean targeting the innocent. It means building trust, fostering understanding, and working together to create a safer, fairer society." Lawson was silent for a long moment, his gaze locked onto Father Monroe's. Finally, he gave a slight nod, his expression unreadable. "I'll think about that," he said before turning and walking out of the office. Father Monroe watched him leave, his eyes thoughtful. He knew that change wouldn't come overnight, but he also understood that every small step mattered, and he was determined to keep moving forward no matter what challenges lay ahead. In the weeks that followed, tensions between the church and the police began to ease. Officer Adam Lawson, though still guarded, started approaching his work with a new perspective. He began attending community meetings, listening to the concerns of the people, and working to build bridges instead of walls. As for Father Monroe, he continued to lead his congregation with compassion and strength, just as he always had. The church's outreach programs flourished, and more people came forward to show their support. One Sunday morning, as Father Monroe stood at the pulpit, he looked out at his congregation, his heart full of gratitude. The church was packed, and the air buzzed with joy and unity. "We have been through so much together," he said, his voice resonating through the room. "But no matter what happens, we remain steadfast in our faith, in our commitment to one another, and in the belief that love will always triumph over fear." Applause filled the sanctuary, the congregation's support for Father Monroe unwavering. He smiled, his eyes shining with hope for the future. "Now go out there," he declared, his voice firm and clear, "and continue to be a light in the darkness, a beacon of hope and love in a world that so desperately needs it." As the service concluded, the congregation gradually left the church, their spirits uplifted and their hearts filled with inspiration. And as they stepped outside under the bright sunlight, they knew they were part of something greater than themselves, a community bound by faith, love, and the belief that together they could overcome anything. The story of Father Monroe and his community comes to a close, serving as a powerful testament to the strength of faith, love, and unity. It teaches us that even in the face of adversity, misunderstanding, or injustice, we can stand firm if we remain true to our core values. Justice is not only shaped by grand decisions, but also by the small, everyday actions, treating others fairly, listening more, and refusing to let fear dictate how we see the world. So what can we do today? Let's start by building bridges instead of walls. Let's ask questions instead of making quick judgments. Let's listen to the stories of others with empathy and a willingness to understand. We can all be agents of change, even in small ways, whether it's helping a stranger, speaking up when we witness injustice, or simply treating one another with kindness. But what will the world look like in 2025? And by 2030, will racism still exist? The truth is, change doesn't happen overnight. But 2025 could be a turning point, a time when individuals take stronger action, demand clearer justice, and unite more than ever to stand up for what is right. By 2030, can we say that racism has been completely eradicated? Perhaps not, but what matters is that it will no longer be accepted as the norm. We can build a society where prejudice is gradually erased, where fairness is no longer a privilege but a fundamental right for all. What do you think about this story? Does it remind you of something in your own life? Share your thoughts in the comments, because discussions like these are the first steps toward change. Personally, I believe justice is not just a distant dream, it is something we can and must build every day. The world does not change simply because we wish it to, it changes because we take action. And as Father Monroe said, as long as we continue to be a light in the darkness, hope and love will always prevail. Disclaimer: this story is entirely fictional, created to raise awareness of important social issues. Our goal is to emphasize personal and collective responsibility, the spirit of justice, and the importance of treating all individuals with respect and dignity, regardless of their race, status, or circumstances. We strongly oppose all forms of violence, discrimination, prejudice, and injustice in society. The events in this story may be emotionally impactful and are meant to be thought-provoking, encouraging reflection on moral values, fairness, and compassion. Viewer discretion is advised. If you feel that the content may affect you emotionally, please consider before proceeding. We hope this story fosters positive discussions and contributes to building a fairer, more compassionate society.